Hail, hail, the Celts are here, and what the hell do we care now? We've got the one, the only, Celtic by numbers. We've got Alan Morrison joining us this week for the Flagship podcast. Alan, second time I've kind of met you, this time in a cyber sense or a virtual sense, you know, but great to have you on the show, mate. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, absolute pleasure, Quinny. I was just saying off camera there when we met at the fan debate, there was a section at the end where all the fans were asked some quick-fire questions on a one-to-one basis, and Quinny's answers were just hilarious. I mean, I don't know how they recorded it because I was just guffawing in the background. So it's yeah, good to meet you again, mate. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
No, absolutely. And you know, the fan debate thing was like, you know, it's one of those moments where you're in that room. Like for me, anyway, I showed up a little bit later than you guys, and you know, it was quite a surreal experience. You know, I said to you just kind of before we got together, like I was really quite like blinded by the lights at first, you know, because it was like a decent wee production, and it was good to see the reception from the Celtic community, you know, for supporting the cause and all the rest of it. And maybe we'll get a wee bit of a round two, Alan, because after, you know, the derby we've had at the weekend there in the semi-final, pretty much all the attention in Scotland and Glasgow is now like looking onto the horizon. Everyone's looking into the summer. Everyone's looking into the new season. The aftermath of this season's already being dissected. We're not quite there yet, obviously, you know. And the conversation that's going to bound between, you know, Celtic fans and Rangers fans that like work together, pals, family members and whatever, is the difference in the teams and is what's going to happen between now and, you know, the start of next season. And it's that famous term that we keep hearing now, the gap. You know, how big is the gap? For me, it's like it's one of these things that kind of goes beyond the pitch, I think. And you're one of these people that I love listening to because you've also got your head and your eyes focused on some of these other areas in terms of, like, also I was listening to you last night. You're talking about the difference in ticket sales and match day revenue and that kind of stuff. Never mind, obviously, the transfer activity we've had. And is it how hard is it to quantify this gap? Is probably what I'm kind of dancing around here, Alan.
Yeah. So it's like anything. At a superficial level, you could be quite precise, but in reality, there's a lot of variables, and it's therefore quite complicated. And then, like you say, thinking about it in terms of, you know, off the pitch and on the pitch. But as we know in football, you know, football is an industry, is a business, and therefore, you know, performance off the pitch is going to have a large bearing on what happens on the pitch. And you know, that might sound a bit cold, but that's just the reality of it. And that's why there's so much attention now on the business of football. There's podcasts dedicated to it, and so on and so forth. And we all take an interest in it, mainly because our own media don't do that job for us, so we have to do it ourselves. And like many people, I'm a keen, as I'm a keen amateur on, as far as the data is concerned, I'm a keen amateur on the sort of financials situation. Because, as I say, to me, it does drive. Ultimately, it will drive what's on the pitch. So I think to sort of frame it, I mean, if you wanted to start with a very simplistic view and then kind of introduce some of the variables of it, is, you know, if those of you that follow David Lowe on Twitter, David was obviously in the room when Fergus McCann took over Celtic in '94 and essentially built the modern Celtic as it is today. The modern Celtic Park and the modern business that it is today, and the, you know, the revenues that it generates compared to other teams in Scotland. So David's a well-kent face in that regard, and someone to be respected. He actually on Twitter the other day put a figure of around 15 million a year that Celtic have an advantage over their rivals. Now what does that mean? So he's looking at the sort of less variable aspects. So things like, we've obviously got, it's about 9,500 larger capacity, which means we've got around about, I think it's 8,000 more season ticket books. And I think we've got about 2,500 more corporate seats. So if you think about that on a season by season basis, that's roughly a sort of 15 million advantage, sorry, £5 million advantage just there. That's before you once you've sold all your tickets, assuming you sell them all before you even start, you're 5 million up. Then you've got to think that every single match day, Celtic can get a bigger capacity inside Celtic Park than they can at Ibrox, right? So for a European game, they'll have 50,000, we'll have nearly 60,000, right? So you've got to think about, well, how much money do people spend on average when they go to Celtic Park or Ibrox. Both grounds are in Glasgow. It's the same broad population of people, and
Yeah.
information I've received, it's between £20 and £25 a head that people will spend at the ground on average. So that's on things
Sure.
like drinks and food and programs and ticket, etc., merchandise and so forth. So if you assume that both clubs have the same amount of fixtures every season, they have the same number of league games, obviously. They, if both got into the group stages of Europe, they probably have the same number of European games, and depending on cup draws, they might have a couple of home cup ties as well. So if on a like for like basis, both teams had the same number of home games, then because of the match day spend difference, again you're looking at another sort of anywhere up to 5 million of additional income revenue that Celtic will get simply because they've got a bigger ground, and this is people spending money on the game. And then the third sort of thing that isn't as much of a variable. These are all variables. Obviously, you might not sell your season tickets. You might not have as many home games, etc. Is the just what's called very broadly commercials. So commercials are things like you're at the Adidas deal for Celtic, the sponsorship on the front of the shirt, and all that sort of kind of thing, right? So
Hmm.
I'm taking off the table here European prize money, and I'm taking off the table things like TV income from Europe, because let's look at that as a separate pot. So you just look at
Yeah.
the commercial performance of the clubs. If you look at the last set of accounts, Celtic generate around about 10 million more a year purely on commercials. Now, again, that's a variable. Their commercial performance has been improving as the club has worked its way through the divisions and into the Premier League. And we know that Celtic have got the best kit deal that's ever been achieved in Scotland with Adidas. And you could argue that that might close, but then I would argue, well, if you look over at Ibrox and you think about the commercial relationships that that club has, they are about to go to court or have ended up in court with virtually every commercial partner they've done business with, right? So that's a significant thing, because the world of football finance is like anything, any industry. It's a village, right? So people know each other, people talk, and I would have thought that the reputational damage by ending up in court with all your commercial partners virtually, not just your own personal partners, but also the league partners. Look at the dispute with Singe. Look at the current manufactured nonsense with Glenn's vodka. Because that's a dispute that not only impacts the club, that club, it impacts the sponsor, and it impacts the other clubs in the league. It impacts you're really not acting in good faith with the other clubs in the league, and it potentially could impact their income. So all of those things suggest to me that they're not going to massively close that commercials gap anytime soon. So even if you say, well, okay, let's look at this season. This season, they've actually had 4 more home games than Celtic, because they had 2 European qualifiers, and I think they had a couple of extra home cup ties than Celtic did. So that kind of probably negates the 5 million gap that I talked about. So 15 million that David Lowe came up with is not a bad estimate. But what you have to realize is, number one, £15 million is chicken feed when you think about the English Premier League, right? £15 million
Oh,
would get you some Croatian kid to sit on the bench for most EPL clubs. But £15 million for a Scottish club is absolutely game changing, right? It's an enormous
yeah.
amount of money. But we're not saying that Celtic are £15 million have a £15 million start over them this season. We're saying they have a start over them next season, and the season after, and the season after, and the season after, and the season after. And the question that they have to reconcile is, how do you close that gap? And to sort of, and I'll shut up now. I'll make the last point, which is, this comes back to Fergus McCann, which is where I started, and the inbuilt advantage that he gave Celtic by building that stadium and the capacity of it. And we should be forever grateful to Fergus and the team for doing that. And one of the reasons that David Murray went down the route of EBTs was because it was the only way he could think of to close that gap, that inbuilt financial advantage that Celtic have. So if we're assuming that illegal tax schemes are off the table, how do they close that gap? And that's the question.
Yeah, big time. I was just on that note of, like you're just kind of saying there, like it's not just that revenue season, like this season today, it's been a compound thing. And I'm reminded of a quote, I don't know if it's of its origins, but the most powerful force in the world is compound interest. So
absolutely. Hallelujah.
So yeah. So Celtic have been running on that compound interest for, like all my life, basically. Yeah. Give or take
that unexpected goals, yeah.
Expected goals, expected threat as well. We love a bit of
that.
Or don't. That's it. Yeah. But it is a very difficult thing to quantify, as you say, because like that commercial aspect, like, is one of these very kind of understated things, and maybe kind of almost dismissed, I guess, by rival fans when you see the tours we're going to be doing in Southeast Asia, the tours we've done early millennium in North America against Real Madrids and all this kind of stuff, and like. In that kind of period where Rangers were in the lower leagues and they were having to, do their thing, there was a lot of criticism from Celtic fans at the time. I remember the difficult journey through Scotland.
We can talk about that as well. Sorry, I'll just drop this in. But here's a question to ponder, which is, what I'd love to know what they think the end of the journey is. We'll come back to that.
Well, they've been to a European final, I guess. So if they were going to make a wee song and a dance over it, I guess that would be it. But also, ultimately ends in defeat, sadly. But I remember a lot of Celtic fans being quite upset during that period at the lack of, let's just call it ambition overall on different levels. Appointments, signing targets, money spent, whatever it might be. And I always held a wee bit of solace in hoping that maybe the club are just being like super smart and keeping some of their money until it's required, hopefully, and, maybe we've seen some evidence of that, maybe we haven't, and all the rest of it. But I think like one of the parts of this gap that is quite understated and maybe quite hard to quantify is like you're saying there, it's a small industry in terms of business and commercial links and transfer circles and whatnot. And the relationships you have are really what dictate the business you do. Like one of the things I love listening to your guys' show is like you give good credit to like the Red Bull system and all the stuff they do. That's not necessarily like, obviously money builds infrastructure and whatever, but that is legitimately like people know people. They know the phone number to phone, they know the guy that's actually in the area and runs the club or all this kind of stuff. And Rangers don't have any level of infrastructure like that. Even in those seasons where we lacked ambition, let's say, we were still like trying to get some youth prospects like across Europe, and even like a guy whose name I see pop up on my screen quite a lot these days, like Andrew Gutman. We even tried to go and get guys from different places and try some different things. Obviously, it didn't work out, and maybe we took like low cost, high risk opportunities more often than not. And maybe, that's why we've seen that kind of lack of real traction grow into the transfer market of people going year on year. But it feels like now that we have very strong links across world football, and the manager's obviously a huge part of that. But it does feel like, the club is quite well positioned in European and world football. And that part of the gap in terms of getting the sniff on a player when they're coming up before other bigger teams come and get them, or even just having the favourable conversation with the agent, and they know already. Like, I can't remember who it was I heard recently, but I heard somebody that was linked to Rangers and ended up signing for us. I can't remember who it was, but it might even been Aaron Moy. I think somebody's telling me Aaron Moy maybe trained at Rangers like last year for a week or something, or I can't remember if that may not be him. I might be remembering this wrong. And sometimes it is a big part of, like that, relationship that you have with intermediaries, with the people that make the conversations happen, with the people that identify the talent, because when you look at their talent, what's been heralded as their Dembele's, as their Edwards, as their Van Dijks, both of them, Kent and Morelos, are leaving for nothing and nobody wants them. Like, it's, so that's a huge part of the difference.
The squad management is absolutely, the squad management is absolutely crucial. And so it's a tricky one, because you could argue, certainly in a Scottish context, that Celtic have been, for a long period now, been very successful. It's even going back to, sort of selling Stan Petrov, Ki Sung-young, etc. Going back to the early sort of part of the late part of the 2000s. You could argue that the model was very much you either got to the Champions League group stages or you sold at least one major player, and that was the sort of model. And Celtic did a good job in bringing people like Wanyama and Van Dijk in for low money and selling for much higher money. And that has to be the way to go. It's the only variable you can control directly as a football club, because obviously, success in Europe, which is a game changer for Scottish clubs, getting into the Champions League group stages, getting out the group stages, is all comes down to the kick of a ball, and so many variables there. Really, you can't plan for it, really. But what you can try and plan for is a strategic approach to player trading, and I would say Celtic have been incredibly successful in a Scottish context, but I would still say we lag behind other European clubs of a similar size to us in terms of our ability to do that. And it's something I know, on the Huddle Breakdown pod, James has been fairly consistently critical of the club in terms of failing to really bring in younger, more athletic players and more aggressively start to sell them. And this is something that Ange Postecoglou mentioned this season. He said, the supporters and the club need to get used to a much more aggressive transfer strategy. And what he meant by that was just a quicker turnover of players. So, Juranovic and Giakoumakis were only here for a season and a half, 18 months, and they were flipped for a quick profit. Now, some of that was to do with their own personal desires and the manager's culture of you're either 100% in or you are 100% out, and there's none of this Kent Morelos, Willy won't sign something. If that was Ange, as soon as they didn't sign that contract, they would be sold. They would be sold that day, right? That's the way he operates. So I still think we've got a tremendous amount of work to do as a club to really industrialize our player trading model. I think we've got a good player trading model. I think it's consistent. I think we basically built a whole new squad of players for Ange Postecoglou on the back of being able to sell sellable assets. And to your point about the year-on-year advantage on a football pitch, we can screw that up. We can go down the path of having the wrong manager. We can buy poor players. But what we have got is we've got the cash in the bank and we've got the assets in the squad that if we have a really bad season and it all goes to crap, we can sell some players and do what we did with Ange, which is we flipped a whole squad within a year, made a profit on transfers, right? People only talk about how much Ange spent. They don't talk about how much he brought in, the club brought in, and we can regenerate. Now, going back to Ibrox, they're nowhere near that position. They've got a squad that they've mismanaged to the extent that around, I think, 9 or 10 first team squad players are going to be walking out of the building for nothing, including you mentioned Kent and Morelos, who, let's be honest, at their best, they could have got fees of around 10 million each for each of them at some point, and that would have gone some way to refreshing the squad. You can get 3 or 4, 5 decent prospect, good players, sort of Matt O'Reilly or better, type of players for that. And that's how you do it. You kind of you grow organically like that in terms of the quality in your squad. So yeah, Celtic are in a good spot in that, but I think if I was being critical, we can do an awful lot better, and we need to do an awful lot better. On the other side of the city, yeah, they're facing into a really difficult situation as far as rebuilding that squad.
Yeah. And it makes our business all the more exciting, because when I listen to you guys talk about that, and as we were talking just now, like I'm thinking, sure, we're going to get the bigger advantage on the stadium this season. We're also going to be hitting the group stages. We know that. We're probably selling Barkas, maybe even washing our face on that, which is nice, There's rumours of Abada going. There's rumours as well of some other bits and pieces like Frimpong. We're still maybe going to get paid on him again,
Yeah.
This summer, Ange so far, take Carter Vickers and Jota to one side, because I don't really think they were like out and out like Ange identified and acquired targets, as it were. Maybe a bit of a collaborative effort, a bit more maybe with the club's infrastructure on those ones. But outside of that, no real big fees have been spent. Now, we've had great quality, and like you say, guys like Matt O'Reilly, Iwata, Hitate, Maeda, they've all come in for relatively nominal fees in the European scale of things, With the amount of money we potentially have at our disposal, the level of squad that we have at the moment. So the reason the level of the squad is important is because you need to add something better to that. Ideally, you know, if you're going to go out and improve, that's been what seems to be the mantra. You know, we go and get Iwata in, who's J League Player of the Year and should come in and disrupt what we think is a really settled midfield, you know. So if we were going to go and spend a bucket of money, Alan, you know, how big is the bucket, would you reckon? And where would you spend it? Where would you spend it? Or where do you think we might spend it? I don't know.
So you know, a lot of things you mentioned there, you know, going to Japan and Korea, I think the Australia Cup was very lucrative, etc. These are all very much on the variable side of the revenue stream, in that you cannot predict year on year that you're going to have this tour or that tour, or you're going to get this windfall from selling a player 5 years ago, like you mentioned, Frimpong. These are things that I would take as almost sort of, you know, they protect you from a rainy day type of things. You couldn't plan a 5 to 10 year horizon financial model on the assumption that you're going to get a Frimpong type dividend, you know, every couple of years or what have you. So we have to be a little bit careful on that. The second thing to realize is that if we go and spend, let's say, £10 million on a single player, a £10 million player comes with the expectations of a £10 million player's wages, right? And we have to remember that we have to keep within, you know, a reasonably tight wage structure within the club. And in fact, you know, coming back to regulations, financial sustainability regulations under UEFA, which you know, we've been trying to dig into. Why is one Scottish club on a UEFA watch list? Because no one in the press wants to talk about that or discuss the reasons for that. But those financial sustainability regulations apply to Celtic as well. And one of there's three pillars to it, very simply. One of the pillars is about the sustainability of your wage bill and the percentage of your football income that you're spending on wages. And by in a couple of years' time, that percentage will be down to 70%, i.e. you cannot spend more than 70% of your football income. And I'm emphasizing football income because there are certain types of income like share issues and director loans that are not considered football income. Okay, so you cannot predicate your wage model based on assuming that your directors will punt up for some emergency loans every season. So the reason I say that is that applies to Celtic too. So what UEFA is getting clubs to do is plan on a sustainable basis. And what does that mean? It means that you don't plan on the basis that, oh, we got to the Champions League group stages this year, and we got a Frimpong dividend, and we got 5 million for going to Japan, and therefore we're going to assume that that's going to be our revenue every year, and we're going to pay out wages to 70% of that. That's what you shouldn't do. That's going to be the road to ruin. You have to say, well, what does a normal year look like? An average year, and it's probably, I would suggest, Europa League group stage football, right? That's a reasonable assumption in terms of the variable income. Europa League group stage football, you know what that gives you roughly. You can there's calculators on the internet. You can go and work out how much revenue that will get you each season, and therefore you can plan on that basis. Therefore, I wouldn't get too excited about saying, oh, because of Frimpong, because of Japan, because of this, because of all these variable one-off, not to be repeated activities, that we can suddenly go and buy more players. I think we're in a very healthy position, but the club has to plan now on a sustainable basis, and UEFA will hold us to that. And that is a game changer. Now, that is a little bit restrictive, but it's probably good news for Celtic because we're used to competing with a reckless rival that behaves in a very, delinquent way, frankly, when it comes to football finances.
Yeah, I think part of this whole gap conversation that I was thinking about, and I was just kind of throw this into the mix because you've already referenced it. The gap we should be thinking about isn't domestic. It is actually like Benfica, Ajax, you know, Salzburg, Leipzig, you know, all these kind of that's our gap. That's the way we should be, you know, as a club aspiring to get into.
Right,
yeah, we should hopefully you know, Europa League is very. I'm totally with you on that because over the last 10 to 15, if you're to aggregate it all out, that's probably roughly where you'd find us most seasons, you know. But we should be getting into that mode of, you know, like I'm thinking about like Benfica right at the front of my mind at the moment, just thinking about this kind of stuff because they do spend proper money. Like they went and got a guy from Norway we were linked to called Tengsted. And I don't think they paid anything crazy. It might have been like 12 million euros, 18 million euros or something. But the potential for that guy to then go on and be a direct sale on your own books, not selling them to Southampton or Leverkusen so they can sell somebody for big money. But the hope then becomes and again, who knows how this guy will turn out? It's just the first name that came into my head. I could have said Enzo Fernandez or something, but you go and get somebody for 10 to 12, 15 million or something. And then if they do come big, then when you're selling them to the top table, and you're going up a few levels in terms of the fee received. Because I think a lot of that stuff, like we've kind of referenced already, in terms of like networks and perception and whatever, it was one of the big things I kind of, based on reports at the time, I was quite disappointed about the whole Fraser Foster kind of situation when he left us when we owned him. Because I think like we've seen it with Frimpong directly, and we'll maybe see a wee bit of it depends on people's perceptions with Van Dijk. But when you're Celtic and you sell somebody to a team like directly, and then they go on and have some big success and they do well, then it makes it easier to make the next pitch to the next player. Oh, come and play for us, and then you'll go and kick on your career and play for this team. We went through a really horrible phase of selling people like Stuart Armstrong to Southampton, like Christie to Bournemouth, Ayer to Brentford, Edward to Palace. These aren't like top of the food chain transfer activity. This is like middle of the ground, average stuff. And the gap we should be wanting to get into is that one where maybe it is once in a blue moon, right? But we unearth a player that we've then got the credibility that the top teams then come to us and go, right, well, we're just going to buy him straight from you guys and pay the fees that we see other clubs get, like Bruges, and random clubs get tons of money for players, because they're right in that food chain, and that's where we should be looking. I think.
I mean, I think you're spot on, right? I think, and actually Benfica is quite a good example. I was just while you were talking, I was just sort of checking on what their transfer activity was this season. So this season, guess how much money they have spent on players? Go on, a little quiz.
I'll say 27 million euros.
83 million euros. So Benfica have spent 83 million euros.
Oh, it's going to be a trick.
Guess how much they brought. Guess how much they brought in.
Well, it must be double that, I would say. No,
you're on the right lines. It's just under 260 million. Right.
Jeepers.
So that shows you. Okay, that is the gap, if you like, to our point about what should be our benchmark. What are the gaps we should be worried about? It's we on a good season might sell, and let's look at the Ange's first year. We actually sold for about 40 million worth of talent. Edouard and Ayer and players like that.
Mm-hmm.
It all mounted up to about 40 million, and that's probably a record. Actually, I think I'd have to double check, so. But that's way south of what the volume that we're talking about for Benfica. And we spend, on a good year, or we'll spend about 20 something million maybe on players. So we are nowhere near. That's what I've talked about. It's all about you got to increase the volume, you got to increase the throughput, the churn, and then those values start to grow as you do that. And it means we have to not get too fond of players that we like, of course. But that's how you grow the club, using the transfer market. Now, Scotland isn't as attractive as Portugal, obviously. There are advantages that the Portuguese market has in terms of especially Brazilian players and other players from sort of warmer countries, and South American countries are more kind of disposed to go to Portugal, obviously, for many reasons, lifestyle, as well as it's a well-worn path, and language, and culture and lifestyle, and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So it isn't. I don't think I'm not suggesting that Celtic will get to that level of Benfica transfer performance, but you've got to start closing that gap. You've got to start getting there in small steps. I think we're almost at I don't think we're at the bottom of the ladder, but we're not even halfway up really at all, I would say. So there's a load of potential there. And I think interesting point you made about coming back to where we get players from. I still have a concern that we're still hugely reliant on Ange, and especially Ange's agent Frank Trimboli, on that network of people, quite a small group of people really, and their contacts, especially in the Japanese market. Now, it's right that they exploit the market that they know, but what I would hope is that Celtic are building a scouting network and infrastructure that means that if, when Ange walks out the door, we don't miss a beat as far as being able to scout players. And so, Mark Lowell coming in from Citigroup is obviously an interesting one in that regard, because to your point about relationships and contacts, although Mark Lowell won't have bought the Citigroup database with him, he will have got all the contacts in his Rolodex, if you like, on his, in terms of that network. So that's where Celtic again need to do a lot of. The danger I see is that we're become wholly dependent on Ange as being the sort of the centrifugal force around which everything operates at the club, and that's hugely dangerous for the long term health of the club. I hope he stays as long as possible, but I hope he builds up. The club builds up an infrastructure around him such that he can concentrate on the first team, and the club, doesn't miss a beat when he eventually walks out the door.
Yeah, I would definitely share that kind of fear, and I don't want to talk about I don't want to talk it into existence, because there is some Premier League clubs looking for managers and stuff, But I hope on this occasion Celtic have forward planned on this occasion, and I think my gut on this one tells me the forward planning is called Harry Kuehl, So I don't know. We would like to think that it's the network part, but is the difficult part, because those are some of the biggest signings that we've made. That clutch of guys from J League in terms of bang for buck, hit the ground running, no problems with integration, and are clearly good enough. We've not, so that in itself, obviously it's unique knowledge that's been brought in by the manager, but even that success rate is quite a rare thing in football periods. Never mind Far East Asian players as a group come into Glasgow, the chalk and cheese of it all, So yeah, it's definitely. I think that's quite easily forgotten on all of us, myself included. I'm a big party merchant in that sense, and it's hard to. Sometimes you need to kind of sober yourself up to the fact that this is quite a unique time in a lot of different ways. For down to the people's ability, but also just a bit of good fortune. I think that these are like really good players, really good people, and their ambitions are in the right place and their motivation is.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think they've been selected well. I think Andrew's got his ways of selecting players. He really focuses on the person, but he also obviously has a very strong and definitive idea as to the way that he wants the football team to play, and therefore the players that are going to fit into that. And that's where I think we've been incredibly successful, because we've got clarity of what it is we're trying to do. We can fit the pieces, and we've got clarity around what it is we're looking for. We're able to fit those things together. That's mainly because of Ange personally. As I say, my concern is that going forward, does that all just fall to the ground when he walks out of the building? That's my fear. It's interesting that you mentioned Harry Kuehl. I mean, my perception of Harry Kuehl is that he's quite spiky, and probably is a provocative person to have on the training ground in a good way, and that you know sometimes you need a bit of a sort of bad cop, or somebody who's got a different approach to getting the best out of players. He doesn't strike me as management material, I'll be honest with you, because of that. He's probably a very useful person to have in your team, as being someone who gives you that little bit of something different on the training field, a different perspective, a different approach to dealing with players. And that's all good. But would you have him front of centre? I mean, we've seen, again, going back to Ibrox, we've seen the dangers of plucking somebody from the back room and putting them front and centre with Mickey Beale.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, the guy's very obviously a rookie. I don't want to be too. I mean, he's clearly very good on the training pitch, but it's a very different set of skills to actually be front and centre and lead the club in that way. So I think coming back to the main point really is, which I'm probably labouring a little bit now, is that I just want to see the club build that infrastructure really, such that Ange does not become the foundation upon which it all collapses when he leaves.
Yeah, of course. But it is such a great kind of dynasty that we're kind of building at the club at the moment. Because I think with it sounds like Alistair Johnson has the potential to make it for the final, but we know Carter Vickers is going to be out until next season with the scheduled surgery. And, this part of the season, we are going to see, I think we should see much more of the squad, much more of the kind of role players, maybe get some starts in this kind of final portion of the season. We've obviously got to get the job done, and I don't think Ange would want to be seen to be like acting like job's done already until it is confirmed. So we kind of roll into this Hearts game at the weekend, where I think, Alan, with the exceptions to like the defence that we know about already, I think the manager's probably going to go straight at like this kind of last run of games, maybe like full strength, same team that we see, the same team basically we seen playing Rangers in the semi-final.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you opened the show and you talked about Celtic fans are starting to look forward towards the summer and then thinking about next season, I think that's absolutely right, and I'm no different to you on that one. But I can almost categorically state that Ange and those players will not be thinking any further forward than the game against Hearts, and that is it. And the league has not been won yet, and therefore the team that will be picked to go out at Tynecastle will be the strongest team that the manager feels he has available to him, and that will not change. I think once the league is hopefully is won, then I think we will potentially see a little bit more of the players who haven't maybe played as much getting more game time. That I think, or players that have hitherto been used more as subs, like and probably even Haksabanovic to a lesser extent, Bernabe maybe as well, and some of the younger boys that have been brought in like Bata and Summers and Lowell, they may well get a bit more game time towards the end of the season, which I think I think we all like that. We all, as fans, we want to see what you guys can do. But with that, with Ange again, it won't be a case of handing out minutes to people because he likes them. It will be right. Can you do this? Can you do a job for this team? And this isn't giving away pity minutes. This is, are you good enough? And if you're not, then you won't be here next year, right? It's as simple as that. That is utterly ruthless in that regard. Is Ange, I think, and that's the only way you can be in a professional sports environment, as tough as that might sound. So, yeah, I think there'll be some interesting choices, but we know, Ange is not difficult to read, and he will not be thinking any further than that Hearts game.
Yeah, because I think, like, for me, one of the things I'm most excited about seeing, in terms of the squads coming into the Hearts game, because like, as much as the manager does always start, like you say, he always starts to kill the game. He always goes out to win the game with the best team he can start with. But the subs and how he makes the subs and how the team evolves through the game, I think as Celtic fans, we all really enjoy kind of studying Ange or following him and trying to work him out and what's he trying to move towards and how's the team playing now and who's came on for this guy. It's something we all enjoy. And I think, like, seeing Kobayashi come in, obviously with, I think Iwata can maybe feel a little bit hard done to not to play the semi-final because, he was in good enough fettle, I think, with Rio being out injured. But, when Ange's buying these guys in, Alan, he's obviously buying them with an image in mind. We're kind of making the joke earlier about Rangers and their journey and whatever. But Ange's also on this transfer journey of like building the squad and thinking, right, okay, well, I need to get a striker that can do this. I need to get a winger that can do that, a midfielder, this, that, and the other thing. With Kobayashi coming in at left centre back, and then with Iwata being in the building and in pretty good form, like, is there room for this team to really change the total face of what we think at the moment is the best 11? And maybe just to give you some detail before I let you come back to me on that, like, what does Kobayashi, like, can Kobayashi in this 5 to 6 games make himself number one? Can Iwata make himself number one over this time? Because Ange surely brought them in with the possibility that they could become number one in their position,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in general, there's no doubt, because he said it, that Ange is looking to continually improve the squad. And as I say, that goes hand in glove with what we talked about earlier, which is that, you do need to be sort of flipping players, frankly, and bringing in other players on a more regular and aggressive basis than what we have done. So that does mean that the likes of, Abada, Jota, Kyogo, these sort of players may well be, if the right offer comes in, and we've got some targets identified that can help to grow the team overall, the squad, then that's what we need to start to do. As difficult and as uncomfortable as some of us might feel that is, but it's the only way that a club that's as landlocked as Celtic are into the restrictive market that we're in. It's the only way we can grow as a football club. So, absolutely, Kobayashi, I'm excited to see because he's a left-footed centre back. They're as rare as hen's teeth, and I mean good ones. Good left-sided centre backs are very, very rare. He
Yeah.
looks like a really good footballer. He's probably going to have to adapt to the physicality of the Scottish League as every player that comes in does. So that aspect of it, I'm actually quite excited to see Starfelt play on the right. I think he should be playing on the right. I think his weaknesses are amplified by being on the left hand side, and it helps his game enormously. I think to be playing on the right. So I think that combination of Starfelt on the right and Kobayashi on the left will be a very interesting one to see. And like you say, Iwata, I did think was unlucky because Ange is not infallible. I thought he was wrong to pitch Aaron Moy into the derby, and I think he was wrong to pitch Rio Hitati into the semi-final because he clearly wasn't anywhere near match fit. He trundled around. He did make a couple of great passes in the second half. Moy, we saw, really struggled in the derby just with the intensity of it all because both players weren't match fit. So those decisions continue to concern me. And Iwata would have been somebody that you could have brought in to play in that situation especially at the weekend, and I don't think he's done anything wrong really. I think maybe, but I'm trying to second guess Ange, which is stupid of me really, but I think against Motherwell there was a little bit of a creative deficit, and he maybe felt that by bringing Hitati back in we would just have that little bit more creativity in the game, which I completely understand, but I just don't think he looked fit enough to last the intensity of what was a very physical sort of semi-final. So, and there is a when I'm making those comments, in the back of my mind is a long standing criticism I have of the club of not looking after players that are not 100% fit properly. I get very anxious when we play players that are not fully fit. I know professional footballers say that, well, you're never 100% fit. You're always carrying something, but there's degrees, right? And when players are not fully up to it, and you've got other people in the squad who are, and they may not give you as much in certain aspects, but you have to trust them to go and do a job physically, and you're not going to get the best out of someone if they're not going to be able to give it full intensity. So, and also there's just the care and duty aspect of it. I just would like to think the club look after the players. So bit of a rant there, but it's just a bugbear of mine that not playing players when they're not really fully fit is a bit of a long-standing complaint that I have.
Aye, no, I can dig it, and I think as well, the club historically, we've probably been, like I've been saying on this channel for ages, like this feels like the best squad that I've seen. Really, you could probably go back, maybe O'Neill. There's an argument for that squad, like the total squad being like full of legends and stuff because of everything they achieved, right? But the actual squad in this, like 2 sets of 11 in this squad at the moment is top notch. Like I remember, like when Johnson came in, it was hard to imagine. It wasn't hard to imagine in some ways, right? Because Juranovic wasn't perfect, but it was kind of hard to imagine. Oh, how does will this guy really level us up? Maybe we get lucky and he's just as good or something. But it was kind of hard to imagine that he was going to make us better. But I would say he has, quite feasibly, and it can be hard to imagine, like, Starfelt and Vickers 2 seasons undefeated in the league. Like that's incredible statistics, and it's hard to imagine. Well, how could that possibly become better? And in terms of the style of play, obviously left-footed players, like you say, it's so good because of the passing lines they can hit and stuff. But it is exciting to see how the team can evolve and maybe get better. And Iwata's an interesting part of all that as well, because I do make you quite right. I think with the Motherwell game, there was a bit of a lack of someone that would go between the lines, take the ball on the half turn, and do that kind of thing. So it's going to be an interesting one because the balance in midfield is the trickiest part, I think, because I feel, and I know you guys, I can't remember if it's you specifically or James, but I know you guys say this also quite a lot, but we are definitely missing like a bombastic end-to-end midfielder, like a guy that can run a game, especially if you think about who we'll be playing against in Europe, that kind of opposition. But the balance in midfield is quite a tricky prospect at the moment, isn't it? With the players we have, they're all great, but stylistically, it's a tough balancing act, isn't it?
I do think that. I mean, and this is we're talking about Carter Vickers and Starfelt and being undefeated in the league, and then you sort of look at the Champions League, and you sort of say, well, does that scale up to that level? And let's be brutally honest with ourselves. It didn't. It doesn't. The current squad, we're not good enough to compete at Champions League level. And
Yep.
you could argue, well, okay, we gave it a good go. We were quite plucky. We bothered most of the teams that we played, but really we were nowhere. Now, listen, it's not realistic for us to be anywhere near Real Madrid, clearly, but we have to be competing with the likes of Leipzig if we want to realistically aspire to at least getting out the group and becoming a sort of pot two type of team. That should be our
Agreed.
target benchmark, really. And I think we were a long way short. And we were a long way short. A lot of it does, and you're actually spot on, come down to the we've got very good, skillful midfielders. Hatate, O'Reilly, etc., are exceptionally talented young players. But do they have do they have the talent and the high end athleticism to be the difference makers at the Champions League level? That's the conundrum that Celtic have to find a way to resolve. I mean, if you look at Real Madrid and the midfield they're putting together, so Tchouaméni, and if they're going to sign Bellingham, I mean, and I know we're talking about a different stratosphere, but if
Of
you think
course.
about the profile of those players, that athleticism, the strength, the speed, as well as the skill and technical ability, it's not easy. The football globe is a well scouted market, but Celtic, the only way that we're going to grow as a club and compete at that level is by increasing the throughput of players and being able to identify and pick up those types of players at the earlier age group when they're younger, and getting a couple of 2 to 3 years out of them, and then you selling them on to the likes of, like you say, Leverkusen or Dortmund, and they then end up at Madrid or whatever. So that's the challenge ahead of us, and it's the challenge that you know I think Ange is very much aware of, is that yeah, we did okay in the Champions League group in terms of it was a credible performance. But if you look at how easy we were to play against, how easy we were to play through, and that manifests itself in the XG, the expected goals against, you cannot be conceding 2+ XG to the likes of Leipzig and Madrid. You will end up on
Yeah.
the back of an absolute hammering a lot of the time if you do that. And that's why I think, in terms of the growth of the team, it was very telling to me how pleased Ange was at the end of that semi-final. And I think the reason that one of the reasons he was pleased was that the team showed him something a bit different. It showed a certain resilience. Celtic were comfortable
Yeah.
in a game that they only had to win. They didn't have to go chasing goals. The opposition were desperate. It was their whole season ended that day on if they didn't win that game. And they were, easily the best team that will play in Scotland. But there was a level of comfort and that in our defending. I think that's the aspect that pleased him most, because we're going to have to step up in terms of our defence and in terms of our resilience when we play in Europe again next season, because we were too open this season. We were too easy to play through, and the likes of Madrid were able to just pick us off almost at will. They were able to draw us on, let us have a lot of the ball, and then bang, wait for the legs to tire and just hit us on the break. Leipzig were able to run all over us in midfield just through
Yeah.
athleticism and better speed and strength, really. So that's the challenge ahead of us, is to grow the squad. And I think the midfield remains the area I'm most concerned about in terms of our ability to compete at that level. Because I think you mentioned Alistair Johnson there. Alistair Johnson, I think, gives us something in terms of defensive stability. And I think we've said
Yeah.
on the show, if we could get if we could take Alistair Johnson and Carter Vickers and clone two players to play on the left side, they're almost identical but left-footed, then I think we would have something like a defence that's up to competing at least at that level.
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it. In fact, I'm a big fan of the whole defence. I love Greg Taylor. I think what he does on left back and the special role that he's got is pretty good. But yeah, that two sides of the pitch that Alistair Johnson does give us. Yeah, no, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. When I think about the Champions League campaign, like I do agree with everything you've said, Alan, of course, but I do think that, like, for the squad as a whole, it was maybe a wee bit too early, because I'm remembering, I think it was Leipzig away, Abelgard played, and I think Starfelt only played against Real Madrid on the last day. I think the same, Jota didn't play much either.
I know
Obviously, got his goal in the last
Carter
game.
Vickers missed games. Yeah, Carter Vickers
Yeah,
missed games, and McGregor missed, I think, half the games as well. But
yeah.
listen, we can't make those
But
excuses
no,
anymore. We should have them.
same
Yeah.
against opposition. I'm with you,
Mm,
but just something I thought
mm,
it just came to mind. I thought I'd add in. Because I remember
yeah.
Leipzig. I'm sure it was Leipzig, but Maeda was playing wing back. And I'm thinking, where were we actually doing back then? Also, must have been some injuries and international windows and a lot of stuff going on. But it will be really exciting. I think. Like so, what I'm hoping to see, like with the Hearts game, and then like the last kind of run to the Inverness match as it was, is a bit of an idea now of like if Iwata was to get into the team, like how does the best team look with Iwata in it? Is it him and McGregor? Is it him, McGregor, and Rio or O'Reilly? And how does that maybe work and move? Because I love McGregor as much as the next guy, but it does. I'm looking at it and thinking, I don't know if in the cold light of day, if Ange was at a different team that wasn't Celtic and didn't have Callum McGregor in midfield, he would play Iwata, Rio, and O'Reilly perhaps, or something like that. So it's if you think about his model on paper, almost, like that's maybe more the way you would see it going. Obviously, McGregor's, he's the man. Of course, don't want to see anything happen to him. But it is going to be really interesting to see how the team moves on, because he's got to have an idea now with that Europa League campaign in season 1, and then obviously that Champions League campaign last year of, how do we move on and how do we get success here? Because last year he promises we'd be bigger and better in the league, and he delivered. No two ways about that. And I'm sure, part of his agenda moving forward will be getting Europe, getting some sort of credible campaign under everyone's belt,
Yeah, no, I think listen, you mentioned Callum McGregor there, but these are the difficult conversations and plans that professional clubs that aspire to be, competing at the elite level have to have. I mean, Callum McGregor is going to be 30 years old soon, and he's played a lot of football, and he's in arguably the most important sort of role in the team. Now, I'm not going to write off Callum McGregor because he's been terrific and he's consistently terrific. But you have to think exactly as you said. How do you want to play? What is going to be competitive at that higher level? And what is that going to take? And is Callum McGregor actually the best player to have in that team? I'm not saying he isn't. I'm just saying these are the questions that I would expect a well-organized elite sports team to be asking and to be considering. And if the answer is, and because we've seen it, we saw it to our own detriment before our very eyes, that we played Scott Brown in a pivotal role for far longer than we should have done. And you can't do that at professionals. And I know there's many examples of this in sport throughout the world of great storied players being played longer than their actual utility and value to the team. This is a ruthless, vicious business, and to compete with these teams, we're going to have to be ruthless and vicious in our decision making as regards who we think is good enough to compete at that level. And as I say, I'm not writing off Callum McGregor, but as he moves into his 30s, you have to start thinking about it and start thinking, well, what is the way forward, and are we on the right path here? Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because that kind of central defensive position, like if we are going to get another midfielder, surely it's somebody, like you say, it's athleticism that we're after now that gets added into that midfield. Technical ability, forward movement, we've probably got like apt levels of that for the competition we're going to be at, but we need something else in there that is athleticism is the best way of putting it. So I'm quite looking forward to seeing.
It's the way that we play. Sorry,
Yeah.
Quinny. It's the way that we play. I mean, the
Okay.
biggest issue I think Celtic had in the Champions League this year, if you wanted to if I had to prioritise it, was that when we play in Scotland, we generally have anywhere between 65 and 75% of the ball, and that means that for the rest of the time we can press like buggers, press like buggery, and put the other team under pressure, and we win, and we generally win the ball back very quickly. Actually, and that's a lot to do with the competence and ability of the other teams, and also just the fact that we've got quite an organized press, right? Okay, you suddenly flip that when you get into Europe. You're playing Leipzig or Madrid or what have you. Suddenly, we've got the ball for 40%, 35% of the time, and they've got the ball for 65% of the time. We cannot press with the same intensity in those moments in the game when we don't have the ball. We simply can't do it. This is how Ancelotti
Yep.
worked out Celtic in that first game at Celtic Park. He let Celtic have He let Celtic come onto Madrid, and they kept possession almost. I mean, I remember, Modric getting the ball on his own goal line. The goalkeeper sort of flipped it over, and they were doing everything they can to keep the ball, and they were doing everything they can not to pass the ball out of play. So there was no long passes. They were all short passes, and I think there was something like ridiculous. I can't remember their exact number. But there's something ridiculous like 3 or 4 throw-ins in the whole half. Right, the ball was in play for something like, in Scotland the ball was in play something like 50 minutes or 55 minutes. Something. The ball was in play something like 65 minutes in that game because their game plan was to keep the ball, keep the ball, keep the ball, keep the ball in play, make Celtic chase, press, and then the second half just blew us away. Right,
Yeah,
right. That's what's going to
fair.
happen. Teams are going to work that out, because we cannot press as aggressively with the players that we've got, and the lack of athleticism, and nor can you do it feasibly for 65. For when you've only got the ball for 30 minutes. So that's the big conundrum that you've got to work out. And some of it's to do with approach. Sometimes you just have to fall back and just be compact, right? And some of it's to do with personnel. With the best will in the world, can the likes of O'Reilly, Hatate, McGregor, can they actually press teams of those standards for for more than half the game? Is that even feasible to do? So these are the big uh, complex gaps that Celtic need to close in Europe to be successful.
Yeah. I think one of the things I'm looking forward to, this is just what's coming to my mind as you're talking, Alan, but like one of the things where I see other teams of our kind of, let's just say, general stature in European football, like do well in the current age of today, it's in attack, you've got pace and you've got clinical finishers, like, and again, you could, like, if you look at like the team in Belgium, USG, the kind of Brighton subsidiary, they got to the quarterfinals or something this year. Like, there's like teams around Europe that do well in Europe, they have pace and attack, they can flip the switch and go and counter attack, because unfortunately when you're a bit smaller and you're having to play the bigger teams, like sometimes the only chance you're going to get to run into space is going to be on the break, and I think in attack, probably the pace is one of the best things we've got going for us, with Jota, Dice and Kyogo, obviously, for the most part. So it's definitely exciting stuff for sure. Looking onto that horizon, but yeah, like you said, the manager will not be looking onto any horizon. It's all about Hearts this weekend. Could I get a score prediction out, Alan, for what you think the score will be at the weekend?
I'm expecting us to get the job done. I really am. I think it'll be a fairly clinical 2-0 to Celtic.
Oh, a clinical 2-0. I'm very biased, and I would say I'm a bit of a party merchant when it comes to this stuff, but I think Hatate loves this fixture. I think Kyogo's in great form, chasing the goals down. I could see this being, I don't know, I'd like to see us score about 4 or 5 in this game, but especially with wee Naismith in the dugout for Hearts as well, that would just be extra banter on top,
Well, it would be great, but we know, given who's in the dugout and given that they're fighting for a third place, right, it's going to be a physical. They're going to come out kicking everything, aren't they? Because that's generally how Hearts have got good performances against Celtic, is coming out and playing that way. Unfortunately, and we know that's what we're going to get. But and that was the same at the weekend, I guess. And I think, I'm sure the manager will have the team prepared for that approach.
So lots of set pieces and a Starfelt goal were thrown into the mix as well then.
Oh, you're dreaming now, yeah.
Love it. Well, if anyone's going to the game, travel safe, good luck, enjoy yourself. Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Thanks a lot for joining me this week.
No, thanks, Quinny. Again, it's a pleasure to be asked, and thank you very much for having me on.
My pleasure, mate. And hail, hail.
Hail, hail.